The baby's first cry echoed through the cold stone walls of a medieval cottage, muffled by straw and shadow. The midwife smiled faintly. Another child had survived the night. But when the infant reached out, tiny fingers curling toward the air, the midwife's breath caught. The mother, pale and trembling, saw it too. The baby grasped with its left hand. For a moment, the room fell silent. Then the midwife crossed herself. "God forgive," she whispered, turning the baby's wrist as if it might change. The mother pulled the child close, hiding it beneath the blanket. Outside, the church bell tolled dawn, announcing both birth and warning, for in this world, not all births were blessings. To be left-handed in the Middle Ages was not a quirk of nature. It was a sign, a whisper from forces people feared to name. The right hand was the hand of order, of blessing, of divine will. It was the hand that signed the cross, that swore oaths before kings, that fed the body and cleansed the soul. The left, however, belonged to the shadows. It was the hand of the devil, the mark of betrayal, the touch of corruption. The Bible itself seemed to confirm this. In Matthew, Christ places the righteous on his right hand, the sheep, and the damned on his left, the goats. This imagery burned into the medieval imagination like scripture carved in bone. The right side was heaven, the left, hell. In churches across Europe, frescoes showed the saved rising on Christ's right, radiant and pure, while the condemned writhed on his left, clawing toward the abyss. The meaning was unambiguous. To lean left was to lean away from God. And so, even before a left-handed child could speak, its fate had begun to twist. Parents watched for signs. Which hand reached for the spoon? Which one grasped the toy? Which hand traced the first letter in the dirt? The wrong choice, repeated too often, could spark panic. Families feared gossip. Priests feared scandal. Some tied the left hand behind the child's back. Others forced them to sleep on it, numbing the arm until the evil habit weakened. Those who failed to change were often hidden, the secret shame of a pious household. The superstition wasn't confined to homes. The church itself reinforced it through ritual. Every blessing, every prayer, every sacred gesture was made with the right hand. Priests lifted the host with the right. Knights received the sword on the right shoulder. To use the left was to desecrate. In some regions, even entering a church with your left foot first was thought to invite misfortune. The world was divided down the middle, light and darkness, grace and sin, right and left. This was not mere ignorance, it was the architecture of faith itself. Medieval life was built on hierarchy. Every man, woman, and child bound to an order decreed by heaven. To be left-handed was to stand outside that order, to embody disorder. It wasn't just strange, it was wrong. People didn't understand how or why. They didn't need to. The church had spoken. Yet behind the sermons and fear, there lingered something older, something primal. The fear of the left reached back before Christianity, before Rome, to the dawn of human superstition. The right hand was the one that wielded the weapon, that greeted, that gave. The left was the one unseen, the one that shielded or struck. Even the body seemed to conspire in its prejudice. The heart lay on the left side, vulnerable, exposed. And so, over centuries, instinct hardened into doctrine. In the candlelight of a medieval chapel, a priest might never see the trembling of a left-handed child forced to cross himself with the wrong hand. But the child felt it, the sting of confusion, the weight of invisible sin. For him, the body itself became a battlefield. Each movement carried meaning, each gesture a choice between heaven and hell. And in that struggle, lay the quiet terror of the medieval soul, that God, in his infinite wisdom, might have created someone marked for damnation from birth. Long before the ringing of church bells and the echo of Latin hymns, the curse of the left hand was already whispering through history. The story begins not in the Middle Ages, but in Rome, the empire that would one day give its language to the church. To the Romans, the word sinister meant left, but also unlucky, ominous, ill-omened. A bird flying on the left side of an augur's vision could foretell disaster. A leftward turn at the wrong time could doom an entire campaign. When Latin became the sacred tongue of Christendom, the word's shadow came with it. Language, as it always does, shaped belief. The right hand was dexter, from which we get dexterity, skill, and grace. The left was sinister, clumsy, cursed, corrupt. These were not just words. They were judgments disguised as grammar, etched into the very structure of thought. When medieval monks copied their scriptures, these meanings seeped into the margins, reinforcing a world where even language itself sided against the left-handed. As the Roman Empire gave way to Christianity, its old superstitions were not destroyed, only baptized. The Church, rising from the ruins, inherited a vocabulary of omens and reinterpreted them through faith. The sinister became the mark of the devil, the direction of darkness, the realm of temptation. When Christ ascended to heaven and sat at the right hand of the Father, theologians didn't see that as a metaphor. They saw it as a divine hierarchy written into the cosmos itself. But it was not only faith that deepened this fear, it was order. Medieval Europe was obsessed with symmetry, balance, and hierarchy. Everything had its proper place. King and peasant, heaven and earth, man and woman, right and left. The world was a reflection of divine geometry, and anything that broke the pattern was dangerous. The left-handed body was a small rebellion against cosmic order. If God had designed the world to favor the right, then to live otherwise was to flirt with chaos. And chaos terrified the medieval mind. Nature was already full of it. Storms that ruined crops, plagues that killed children, wars that made widows. People searched desperately for patterns, for signs that would explain suffering. The left hand became one such sign, a small, visible symbol of the world's hidden wrongness. When crops failed, or when lightning struck the bell tower, villagers muttered about omens seen from the left. It was irrational, yes, but it gave meaning to fear. This obsession reached into the smallest gestures of life. To eat with the left hand was unthinkable. It was the hand associated with impurity, the one used for unclean acts after relieving oneself. To pass bread or salt with it was rude at best, sacrilegious at worst. Medieval etiquette manuals warned against greeting or touching with the left, calling it a deceitful gesture. A handshake from the left hand might be a pact with the devil himself. Even art reflected this moral geography. In church frescoes, angels appeared always on Christ's right, demons on his left. In illuminated manuscripts, the right-hand side of the page often depicted paradise, while the left showed torment and sin. Painters, sculptors, and scribes internalized the same invisible rule, that holiness leaned rightward, and hell waited just beyond the left margin. Yet the roots of the superstition ran even deeper, older than any altar. Across cultures, from the Celts to the Egyptians, the left side had long been seen as the mirror's dark reflection. Ancient warriors avoided donning armor from the left side first, lest they invite misfortune. Seers turned clockwise, never counterclockwise, when invoking protection. The left was the unknown, the space where shadows gathered. The Church, inheriting this ancient fear, simply gave it a name: Satan. And so, When a child reached with its left hand in a medieval cottage, the fear that rippled through the room was not just Christian, but ancient, a fear older than faith itself. It was the terror of the unpredictable, the unbalanced, the unseen. The left hand was not just different, it was other. By the dawn of the Middle Ages, the curse was no longer just a whisper of superstition. It was law, written into sermons, recorded in confessionals, embedded in the moral code of Christendom. No one questioned it. No one needed to. The right hand blessed and built. The left tempted and betrayed. In the eyes of the medieval world, God himself had made his preference clear. In the medieval world, the human body was not one's own. It belonged to God, or at least to his earthly interpreters. Every movement, every gesture, every habit was measured against divine order. The church did not merely shape how people thought. It dictated how they stood, how they knelt, how they crossed themselves. The body became a map of morality, and the left hand, the forbidden territory. From the earliest years, children were trained in the choreography of faith. In churches lit by flickering candles, priests demonstrated how to make the sign of the cross. Forehead, chest, right shoulder, left shoulder. Always starting with the right, always ending with it. The motion was more than ritual. It was a declaration of loyalty to God's order. A left-handed child, fumbling or reversing the gesture, might draw uneasy glances. "The devil confuses them," some whispered. "He makes them use his hand." The church's manuals reinforced the bias. Priests were taught that physical irregularities, from birthmarks to deformities to left-handedness, could signal spiritual danger. These were not flaws of nature, they were warnings. A left-handed novice in a monastery might be made to wear his habit differently, his left sleeve pinned or bound to his waist. The correction was meant to be moral, not medical. The body, after all, was the soul's reflection, and the left hand its most public betrayal. The sacraments themselves excluded it. Baptismal water was poured with the right hand, blessings made with the right, the Holy Eucharist received into the right. To touch the chalice, to raise the cross, or even to gesture toward the altar with the left was unthinkable. In confession, priests might ask, "Do you use your left hand for things that are rightfully done with your right?" It was not just curiosity, it was suspicion. The church saw in every physical deviation the shadow of rebellion, and the fear ran deeper than ceremony. Medieval theologians believed the body was a battlefield between divine and demonic forces. The right side represented the angelic, the obedient, the rational, the left, the fleshly, the deceitful, the chaotic. St. Augustine himself wrote of the two cities of mankind, one of God's right hand, the other of his left, a metaphor that soon hardened into moral geometry. To live left-handed was, symbolically, to dwell in the city of the damned. Parents absorbed these teachings like scripture. In cottages and castles alike, a left-handed child was disciplined in the name of salvation. Mothers tied their infants' left hands to their sides. Fathers struck them when they reached for food the wrong way. Teachers in monastic schools rapped their knuckles with rods, chanting psalms as they did so. "Better pain now," they said, "than hellfire later." It was not cruelty in their eyes, it was mercy. To save the soul, one must first tame the flesh. Even beyond religion, the church's authority seeped into the mundane. In guilds and trades, apprentices were corrected by masters who echoed ecclesiastical teaching. "God made the right hand for work," they would say, twisting the hammer into the pupil's unwilling grip. A left-handed blacksmith risked sparks flying into his own face. A left-handed scribe smudged the sacred ink. A left-handed servant passed the bread from the wrong direction. Each act became a sin of habit, an invitation to ridicule or rebuke. But nowhere was the Church's influence more complete than in fear. The belief that the left hand could offend God transformed superstition into self-policing. People watched themselves, corrected themselves, judged themselves. To reach for something with the left hand was to feel a twinge of shame, as if the body itself had betrayed the soul. And so, through prayer and punishment, the Church reshaped the simplest act of human instinct, which hand to use, into a spiritual trial. A left-handed person could survive, even thrive, but only by living in constant disguise. They learned to hide their nature, to switch their gestures, to move unseen within a right-handed world. The Church had done what it did best. It turned fear into order. The devil did not need to tempt the left-handed. Society did it for him. And though no scripture ever declared, "Thou shalt not write with thy left hand," millions lived and suffered as if it had. Beyond the echo of church bells and the gaze of priests, life in the Middle Ages was ruled by rhythm, dawn and dusk, sowing and harvest, hunger and brief moments of rest. For most people, faith was not debated, it was lived. And its shadow fell over every gesture, every habit, every simple act of survival. For the left-handed, that shadow was heavier than most. In the narrow cottages of villages and the noisy courtyards of castles, daily life was full of invisible rules. A person was judged not just by their words, but by the motion of their hands. To eat, work, or even greet someone with the left was a quiet rebellion, one that could draw suspicion, laughter, or worse. The simplest mistake could turn into a curse. At the dinner table, for example, the left hand was forbidden. It was the unclean hand, used after relieving oneself, and thus associated with impurity and shame. To touch food with it was to defile the meal, to invite disgust, even blasphemy. When a left-handed peasant reached for bread from the communal bowl, others might draw back or mutter prayers under their breath. Some would cross themselves discreetly, as if to ward off misfortune. And so the left-handed learned to hide. They tucked their stronger hand beneath the table, forcing the right to serve, trembling, clumsy, and alien. In work, the consequences were even harsher. Tools, designed for the right-handed majority, turned against those who wielded them differently. A left-handed blacksmith might burn his arm from a misplaced swing. A tailor's needle might twist wrong. A farmer's sickle, curved for the right, could tear his own hand open. It wasn't just social pressure. It was physical danger. Left-handedness, in a world of handcrafted tools and unyielding iron, could cripple as much as condemn. And still, they persisted, in silence. The left-handed milkmaid learned to cradle the bucket in her left arm, but milk with her right, the muscles of her body contorted into habit. The mason learned to carve from the right side of the block, even when his instincts screamed otherwise. The scribe in a monastery scriptorium dragged his pen with his right hand, smudging ink, sweating through hours of prayer and pain, afraid that a blot on parchment might be seen as a sign of sin. Children bore the brunt of it most cruelly. In village schools, or in the rare classrooms run by clergy, a left-handed student's fault was corrected by force. Their left hand was struck with rods or bound behind their back. Some were forced to write with both hands until the left one trembled uncontrollably. "It is for your salvation," teachers would say. The lesson was not about writing, it was about obedience. The Church had declared the left hand the mark of disobedience, and so even the smallest act of preference became rebellion. Superstition crept into play as well. When dice were thrown with the left hand, people accused the player of cheating. When cards or stones were dealt, to use the left was to invoke the devil's favor. In some villages, a left-handed gesture before a hunt or wedding was enough to delay the event. No one wanted the shadow of ill luck cast upon a day meant for blessing. And if a left-handed person accidentally touched someone with their left hand, it was common for the other to spit in the dirt, to neutralize the curse. In the marketplace, merchants avoided receiving money with their left hand. In guilds, apprentices were taught that to work left-handed was to disrespect the trade. Even in greetings, to offer the left hand was unthinkable, an insult, a mockery, a challenge. Only once in a lifetime, perhaps in a duel, might a man's left hand be openly raised, not in peace, but in violence. And yet, hidden among the fear and mockery was something else: adaptability. Left-handed people survived, not by defying the world, but by mastering its illusions. They learned to fight right-handed, to write right-handed, to live right-handed, while keeping their true nature secret. In a society that believed in the devil's left hand, survival itself was a kind of quiet rebellion. Every gesture became a performance, every meal a ritual of concealment. And still some carried the mark too visibly, the way they held a spoon, or swung a hammer, or stitched a line. Whispers followed them. Unnatural. Witch-born. Touched by the devil. The left hand, unseen yet unforgettable, turned daily life into penance. For others, it was routine. For the left-handed, it was resistance. And in that invisible struggle between what they were and what the world demanded, we glimpse the truest cruelty of superstition, not the violence done by others, but the violence forced upon oneself. The fires of superstition burned brightest when fear needed fuel. And in the late Middle Ages, fear was everywhere. War, famine, plague, each left Europe trembling, desperate for explanations. When reason failed, the church filled the silence with sermons, and the villagers filled it with whispers. Every storm, every stillbirth, every bad harvest demanded a culprit. And often, the hand that pointed toward the guilty was a left one. By the 13th century, the association between left-handedness and evil had hardened into doctrine. The Church's writings and inquisitorial manuals, like the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, didn't explicitly name left-handedness as witchcraft, but the link was already carved deep into the popular mind. To move against the order of nature was to move with the devil. The left-handed did both, quite literally. When witch trials swept through Europe, the signs of guilt were arbitrary, almost poetic in their cruelty. A mole, a scar, a strange birthmark, a habit of muttering prayers backwards, or writing with the left hand. Witnesses spoke of seeing accused women stirring cauldrons or blessing crops with their sinister hand. Others swore they saw left-handed gestures during Sabbaths or curses cast against the sun's course. These were not crimes, but interpretations, and in the frenzy of faith, interpretation was enough. In small villages, the fear took root in everyday life. A left-handed midwife whose patients lost children might be branded a witch. A left-handed shepherd whose flock fell sick could be accused of cursing his own pasture. The logic was circular, the outcome inevitable. What was different was dangerous. What was dangerous was demonic. Trial records tell stories both tragic and absurd. In 1474, in the German town of Wiesensteig, a woman named Gertrude was executed not only for maleficium, the practice of harmful magic, but also because she crossed herself with the wrong hand during questioning. Another, a blacksmith's wife from Rouen, was accused after a priest saw her light a candle with her left hand before Mass. She swore it was habit, not heresy. It made no difference. Habit, they said, was the devil's second nature. The courtroom itself mirrored the theology that condemned them. The accused were made to swear oaths with their right hands, a symbol of truth. If they hesitated, the judges took it as a sign of deceit. Left-handedness in such a setting was a trap. Even innocence could betray itself. Art and sermons reinforced the terror. In stained glass and frescoes, Satan was often depicted as left-handed, his gestures inverted, his blessings reversed. Medieval theologians claimed he mocked God's creation by mirroring it, using his left where God used his right. The devil's followers, it was said, imitated him without realizing it. Every left-handed act was a parody of divine order, the devil's joke on mankind. And yet, beneath the spectacle of flames and sermons, there was something heartbreakingly human: confusion. For most of those accused, the left hand had never meant sin. It was simply who they were. Their hands did not conspire with darkness. They baked bread, held children, tended fires. But in a world where the church saw evil in symmetry broken, the body itself could become evidence. Left-handedness also clung to another feared identity, that of women. Most accused witches were female, and the medieval imagination already saw womanhood as spiritually unstable, physically weaker, closer to nature, and thus closer to temptation. A left-handed woman embodied all those fears at once: disobedient, mysterious, uncontrollable. The sinister hand became one more justification to brand her dangerous. Even those who escaped the pyre could not escape suspicion. A left-handed person might be shunned in markets, avoided at mass, or whispered about as witch-marked. Parents crossed their children when they passed by. Lovers hesitated to touch their hands. A single gesture, an unthinking wave or blessing with the wrong hand, could undo a lifetime of piety. The world of the late Middle Ages was one of mirrors, where faith reflected fear, and fear reflected faith. The left-handed were trapped in that reflection, unable to move without confirming someone's superstition. They were not burned for what they did, but for what others saw. The devil, it seemed, needed no hand at all. Humanity was doing his work for him. In a world terrified of left-handedness, there existed one rare place where the curse could become a weapon: the battlefield. War, after all, had its own gods, and in their service, even superstition could be rewritten. A man who could kill with his left hand was not just strange. He was unpredictable, dangerous, and sometimes divine. From the age of chivalry to the smoke of the 100 Years' War, tales spread of soldiers who fought against the grain. In the clash of swords, where reflex ruled life and death, a left-handed fighter had the advantage of surprise. His stance was reversed. His strikes came from the unexpected side. The right-handed foe, trained since boyhood to guard against the familiar, found his defenses useless. One wrong parry, and the blade slipped through. Knights and mercenaries alike spoke in awe and suspicion of these sinister-handed men. Chronicles from Italy and France record duels where left-handers cut down opponents in seconds, earning reputations as cursed or blessed depending on who survived to tell the tale. In some armies, left-handers were deliberately placed on the left flank, their swords crossing inward, creating confusion in enemy ranks. This became known as the sinistra manus tactic, a grim nod to the superstition it defied. And yet, even in glory, the stigma followed them. A left-handed warrior might win battles but lose trust. His comrades eyed him warily in camp, crossing themselves when he sharpened his blade. "The devil guides his hand," they muttered, half in jest, half in fear. Victory, in the medieval mind, could be divine favor or diabolical deceit, and the line between them was thinner than a sword's edge. One legend, whispered in the courts of Burgundy, told of a knight named Sir Alaric de Brienne, the Devil's Knight. Alaric was left-handed, his swordsmanship unmatched. In battle, his movements were so fluid that enemies said his shadow fought beside him. But in peacetime, priests refused him communion with his left hand. When he crossed himself wrong before Mass, a bishop accused him of heresy. Alaric laughed and said, "If God wanted me right-handed, he'd have armed me so." He died at Crécy, sword in left hand, still fighting when all others fled. His legend outlived his sin. Archers, too, carried the mark. A left-handed bowman could loose arrows faster, his stance reversed from the rank beside him. But in formations, this caused chaos, elbows clashing, strings tangling. Some captains forbade left-handed archery altogether, calling it unholy disorder. Others saw it as an omen of victory. When a battle was won, it was God's will. When it was lost, it was the devil's hand. The truth mattered less than the story. In duels, left-handedness became both curse and strategy. Manuals of swordsmanship, such as those by Fiore de Liberi or later Joachim Meyer, devoted entire sections to fighting against the left. Their tone was not hateful, but wary. They treated the left-hander as a problem to be solved, an anomaly to be anticipated. And yet, in those pages, the stigma began to shift. Here, finally, the left hand was not a sin. It was a skill. For some, it was even a mark of destiny. In Scotland and Ireland, the Gaels carried faint echoes of older pre-Christian beliefs. Their warriors, sometimes left-handed, were said to possess the mirror gift, the ability to see the world as others could not. Clan MacIntyre, whose name meant son of the carpenter, claimed left-handed ancestors who fought with axes reversed, earning the nickname Cleidham Sained, the stranger's blade. Among them, the curse became pride. Still, the contradiction remained. A left-handed knight could win his king's wars, but never his full trust. The church blessed his victories but avoided his touch. His sword arm might be kissed by fortune, but his soul, they whispered, still leaned left. Even the battlefield, the most pragmatic of places, could not fully escape the geometry of faith. But the left-handed warrior embodied something more powerful than superstition: defiance. Each time his blade rose against the current of fear, he turned centuries of prejudice into strength. In a world obsessed with divine order, he fought from its margins, proof that even the condemned could be victorious. And though most of their names are lost, their legacy survived in fragments: family crests showing reversed swords, inscriptions carved backward for luck, dueling manuals that warned of their trickery. The curse had become a weapon, and for once, the left hand struck back. While the battlefield gave the left hand its blade, the workshop and scriptorium gave it a brush. For every knight who fought against superstition, there was an artist who defied it with beauty. Yet even in the quiet, candle-lit spaces of creation, where ink flowed and paint bloomed, the curse still whispered. To write, to draw, to create with the left hand was to court suspicion, for who but the devil himself could work against the natural order of the world? In monasteries, the rule was unyielding. The scribes who copied the Holy Scriptures were trained in precision, every letter sacred, every stroke an act of devotion. The left-handed novice, seated at the long wooden desk, was a problem before he even began. His hand dragged across the wet ink, smudging the holy words. The masters scowled. "The left corrupts what the right makes pure," they said. Some forced the novices to sit opposite-handed, twisting their posture until their spines ached. The result was agony disguised as obedience. And yet a few persisted, producing strange, slanted calligraphy that centuries later would baffle historians with its inverted beauty. In the secular world, artists faced a different sort of trial, not from priests, but from patrons. In an age when the church funded art as propaganda for heaven, no one wanted a painter whose gestures looked wrong. And yet, some of the greatest geniuses of the Renaissance, born just after the height of medieval superstition, carried the mark proudly. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, wrote backward, right to left, mirror script, his quill scratching in the direction forbidden by centuries of faith. Some scholars believed he did this to protect his secrets. Others whispered that it was his way of hiding from the Inquisition. But perhaps, in truth, it was simply the hand doing what came naturally, a left-handed man working against a right-handed world. Even centuries later, when his notebooks were first deciphered, people described them as unnatural, coded, the script of a genius or a devil. Leonardo was not alone. Michelangelo, too, was believed to have favored his left, though he was careful never to reveal it in public. Artists of the guilds learned early to conceal such tendencies. To paint or sculpt with the left hand might invite laughter from apprentices or distrust from the pious. The same hand that shaped angels in marble could, by superstition's logic, be the same hand that shaped demons in dreams. And yet, the left hand was the hand of intuition, of vision, of the unseen. While the right followed rules, the left broke them. The medieval mind feared that rebellion, but art needed it. Some of the most hauntingly beautiful works of the late Middle Ages, illuminated manuscripts, marginal grotesques, and unconventional altarpieces, bear traces of left-handed technique, reversed brushstrokes, unorthodox symmetry, compositions that bend toward the viewer rather than away. These were quiet acts of resistance, preserved in color and gold leaf. Among the guilds, too, whispers spread of craftsmen touched by the left. A glass-blower in Venice whose spirals twined in impossible symmetry. A tapestry weaver in Bruges whose patterns ran counterclockwise but shimmered like water. To be left-handed was to see differently, and though the world condemned it, art could not help but reward it. Creation, after all, was the only sin God shared with man. But the Church's eye was never far. In one account from Florence, a painter was accused of heresy after depicting the Virgin Mary lifting her child with her left arm. A small detail, but one that offended a cardinal who saw it as contrary to divine order. The painter defended himself by saying, "My Lady is merciful. She holds even sinners close." He was fined and silenced. The fresco was whitewashed. Still, the left hand endured. In the act of creation, of shaping something from nothing, superstition met its quiet undoing. Artists bound by neither sword nor sermon used what nature gave them. They painted the world as they saw it, mirrored, inverted, alive. And though their names are mostly forgotten, their rebellion remains visible, hidden in the very gestures of their craft. To create with the left hand was once a sin. But in the slow turning of history, sin became style and shame became signature. The hand that once defied God began, in its own way, to rival him. By the later Middle Ages, Europe began to search for explanations, not in scripture, but in science, or rather in what passed for science at the time, a strange alchemy of faith, philosophy, and folklore. Doctors and scholars no longer wanted to condemn the left-handed. They wanted to understand them. But the theories they built, though dressed in the language of reason, still carried the same fear, that something inside the left-handed body was wrong. Medieval medicine was ruled by the ancient Greek idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, it was said, came from balance. Too much of one humor led to disease, or worse, to moral weakness. A man ruled by blood was brave, by phlegm lazy, by bile angry, by black bile melancholic. But what then explained the left hand? The answer, according to early physicians, was imbalance. The left-handed were ruled by the left side of the heart, which was thought to be hotter, darker, and more impulsive. In essence, they were slaves to their passions. This belief was reinforced by anatomy, or rather by the lack of it. Since the Church forbade most human dissection, doctors studied animals or the occasional criminal's corpse. What they found seemed to confirm their theology. The heart tilted left, the liver dominated the right. To them, the right side symbolized reason and control, while the left held emotion and chaos. It was a perfect moral metaphor masquerading as biology. Astrologers joined the chorus, mapping the heavens onto the body. The right side, they claimed, was governed by the sun, warm, noble, masculine. The left by the moon, cold, moody, feminine. A person born under certain stars might therefore be inclined toward left-handedness, and with it toward disorder. Physicians called it sinistrum temperamentum, the sinister disposition. It wasn't just superstition, it was destiny written in the stars. Some doctors offered cures. Their methods ranged from the absurd to the cruel. A 14th-century text, De Humani Corporis Ponderibus, advised that left-handed children be made to sleep on their right sides to balance the humors. Another, the Compendium Medicinae, recommended bloodletting from the left arm to drain the corrupt influence. Others prescribed prayer, fasting, or even exorcism. The body and soul, they said, were intertwined. If one leaned left, the other could be pulled back right. But not all scholars agreed. A quiet minority began to notice something strange. Left-handed people often showed exceptional adaptability. They learned faster, adjusted more easily, even excelled in arts requiring coordination. A few daring thinkers, such as the physician Michael Scott, astrologer to Emperor Frederick II, speculated that left-handedness might be the mark of unique imagination. He wrote, "As the sun casts its light, so the moon gives reflection. There are those whose minds shine by reflection, and they are of the left hand." For this he was accused of heresy. Still, his words echoed centuries ahead. For the first time, someone dared to suggest that the sinister might also be special. Yet for the average medieval person, medicine only made the stigma worse. A left-handed man might be deemed imbalanced of humor, a woman overruled by cold passions. Madness, too, was linked to the left. Patients in asylums were sometimes tied by their left wrists to calm the disordered side. A child showing signs of left-handedness could be sent to physicians to be corrected, their hands bound or even burned with heated wax. So the flesh forgets its error. The irony is bitter. In seeking to explain the curse, the scholars only refined it. They gave superstition new words, new instruments, new authority. Where once the priest had condemned the left hand for defying God, now the physician condemned it for defying nature. The cross had been replaced by the scalpel, but the judgment was the same. Still, the seeds of doubt had been planted. Beneath the layers of fear and theory, a question lingered. What if the left-handed were not cursed, but merely different? What if nature's balance was broader than man's understanding? It would take centuries for that question to bear fruit. But in the flickering light of medieval laboratories, among glass vials and dusty manuscripts, the first cracks appeared in the wall of superstition. For the first time in 1,000 years, the left hand began to reach, cautiously, toward truth. By the 15th century, the medieval world was cracking, not yet shattered, but trembling with change. The old certainties that had ruled for 1,000 years God's hierarchy, the church's infallibility, the geometry of right and wrong began to twist under the weight of curiosity, commerce, and rebellion. The Renaissance dawned not in a single sunrise, but in flickers of candlelight, in workshops, studies, and courts where new ideas dared to whisper. And among those whispers was a strange reversal. What had once been cursed began slowly to be envied. The left hand, that mark of sin and shadow, was no longer only the devil's. It began to belong to men and women of talent, cunning, and genius. The world was learning that power sometimes hides where it isn't supposed to be. In the royal courts of Italy and France, manners were everything. The tilt of a hat, the turn of a hand, the angle of a bow could determine one's fortune. And while etiquette manuals still warned against uncivil gestures of the left, courtiers began to notice how striking, how memorable, a person appeared when they defied the pattern. A left-handed noble might raise a goblet in toast and draw every eye in the room. He stood out, unpredictable, mysterious, a creature of contrast in a world obsessed with symmetry. Dueling culture, too, changed everything. Swordsmanship evolved from battlefield chaos into an art form, studied in academies and refined in salons. Left-handed duelists became prized for their rarity and advantage. Manuals that once warned, "Beware the left-handed," now taught techniques to become them, how to switch stances, feign weakness, and reverse strikes. A strange irony had taken hold. Society still distrusted the left hand, yet envied its mastery. In the courts of Burgundy and Milan, portraits began to reflect this fascination. Painters depicted nobles holding gloves, scrolls, or swords in their left hands, subtle acts of rebellion against religious convention. To the untrained eye, it was aesthetic. To those who knew, it was audacity. The left hand had become a symbol of individuality, a private smirk at centuries of superstition. Even in politics, the symbolism inverted. Left had long meant subversive, unorthodox, even dangerous. But for princes and merchants clawing for power, those very qualities became virtues. To be left-handed was to be different. And in a Renaissance court, different could mean indispensable. A cunning diplomat or artist could turn suspicion into charm. Letters from the time describe certain courtiers as sinistra mente, of a left mind, meaning clever, deceptive, strategically brilliant. The insult had become an art form. And in the shadows of these palaces, among the thinkers and dreamers who built the Renaissance, the left hand flourished quietly. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Botticelli, all rumored or known to favor the left. Their art was asymmetrical, dynamic, alive. In their drawings, the world turned not by divine order, but by curiosity and contradiction. For perhaps the first time in history, the left hand wasn't forced to hide. It was creating the future. But power is a dangerous mirror. As superstition faded in the cities, it deepened in the countryside. Peasants still whispered of curses. Priests still frowned when a child reached with the wrong hand. The higher one rose, the more one could defy the rules. The lower one fell, the more those rules bound like chains. The Renaissance freed the few, but left the many behind. Still, the transformation had begun. In language, left remained sinister, but in life, it began to mean exceptional. A left-handed swordsman was deadly. A left-handed artist, brilliant. A left-handed scholar, unorthodox, but invaluable. Society was learning that the world's symmetry was not divine, but human, and humans could change their minds. The age of inversion was not about justice. It did not erase centuries of stigma or heal the wounds of superstition, but it did something more subtle. It flipped the mirror. The very qualities once condemned, Difference, unpredictability, defiance became the essence of genius. The left hand had not been redeemed. It had been rebranded. The centuries turned, and the fires of the Middle Ages dimmed, but their smoke never truly cleared. By the dawn of the modern era, Europe had traded cathedrals for courts, priests for professors, superstition for science. And yet, in ways both visible and hidden, the old fear lingered. Reshaped, refined, renamed, the curse of the left hand had become quieter, but no less enduring. Even as education spread, language itself preserved the prejudice. The word sinister, once merely left in Latin, still meant evil. Its mirror, dexterous, still meant skillful, right-handed. In dozens of tongues across Europe, the same pattern held. The right hand was correct, holy, righteous. The left was awkward, clumsy, unclean. Words outlive beliefs, and in this way, the Middle Ages never truly ended. Every idiom carried the echo of judgment. A left-handed compliment, a sinister motive, 2 left feet. In schools, even centuries later, the rituals of correction persisted. Teachers bound left hands to desks, forced children to write with their right. The church no longer burned witches, but it still trained conformity. In the 19th century, parents across Europe and America punished left-handedness as laziness, rebellion, even madness. Doctors, inheriting the same pseudoscience that once blamed imbalanced humors, now called it neurological deviation. The medieval priest had become the modern psychologist, but the goal remained the same: to fix what was never broken. And yet, resistance endured, quiet, patient, inevitable. The same defiance that once burned in the hearts of medieval knights and painters now lived in classrooms and workshops. The left-handed learned to adapt, to switch tools, to mimic the right-handed world without surrendering to it. They turned survival into creativity. The human brain itself, ever adaptable, strengthened both hemispheres to cope, creating patterns of perception and problem-solving unseen in others. What medieval theologians had called the devil's mark turned out, in the light of science, to be a sign of unique neurological diversity. In the 20th century, when modern psychology began to study the phenomenon seriously, the truth emerged. Left-handedness wasn't disorder. It was difference. Artists, musicians, mathematicians, and scientists, from Leonardo da Vinci to Marie Curie to Jimi Hendrix, had all thrived with their sinister hands. The same trait once tied to evil now became linked to creativity, adaptability, and intelligence. The irony was cosmic. What medieval Europe had condemned, evolution had quietly rewarded. Still, the shadow of the past lingers in culture. Many societies still consider the left hand taboo for eating or greeting, echoes of medieval purity laws. Tools and instruments remain biased toward the right, relics of a world designed by and for its majority. Even the handshake, always right to right, is a silent survival of an ancient rule. The left hand hides what cannot be trusted. But history, too, has its reversals. Today, we see a strange symmetry forming again, not divine, but human. The same world that once feared difference now begins to celebrate it. The left-handed are no longer omens of sin, but symbols of individuality, creativity, and defiance. They are living reminders that the boundaries drawn by fear can always be redrawn by time. If one could stand in a medieval chapel where frescoes once showed the damned cast to Christ's left, and tell those frightened souls that one day left-handed would mean talented, gifted, extraordinary, they would not believe it. Yet, here we are. The journey of the left hand is the story of the human condition itself, of how ignorance becomes law, how law becomes culture, and how courage, quietly and stubbornly, rewrites both. From the midwife's whisper in a candlelit cottage to the artist's mirror script that changed the world, the left hand has endured. It survived the cross, the rod, the flame, and the quill. It has held tools, weapons, and brushes, and never once forgot that it was whole. The Middle Ages may be gone, but their lesson remains. Every age builds its own kind of superstition, its own kind of wrong. And every generation must decide which hand it will use to shape the world, the one taught by fear or the one guided by truth. Because in the end, history shows us something extraordinary. The devil's hand was never the left one. It was the one that struck out of ignorance, fear, and conformity, while the other reached quietly toward freedom.